The Middle Ages were a time when cruelty and spectacle blended seamlessly with justice. Executions were not hidden away, but placed at the center of towns, designed to terrify the crowd into obedience. Among the most horrifying of these punishments was the saw torture. It was not quick nor merciful. The executioners devised it to be slow, methodical, and agonizing, ensuring that every cut struck both flesh and imagination. To watch was to be reminded of the absolute power of authority and the fragility of human life. The victim was usually accused of crimes that enraged the people: theft from nobles, betrayal, heresy, or even adultery in some regions. It did not always require guilt. Suspicion was enough. Once condemned, the path to death began with humiliation. Public squares echoed with jeers as the prisoner was dragged before the crowd. Shackled, beaten, and stripped of dignity, they became more spectacle than person. The people's eyes burned into them, feeding on the promise of a gruesome display. The executioners chose a wooden frame or sturdy beam to suspend the victim upside down. Binding the ankles with coarse ropes, they hoisted the body into the air, head dangling low, arms thrashing until exhaustion overtook them. Blood rushed toward the skull. This positioning was not accidental. By hanging a victim upside down, executioners ensured consciousness lasted longer. The blood flow to the brain kept them awake, aware, and capable of feeling every jagged movement of the saw. Death was delayed deliberately. The crowd drew close, pressing forward with morbid curiosity. Mothers shielded children's eyes while others lifted them to see better. Merchants paused their work, and even clergymen attended, not to object but to reinforce the message: sin brings agony. Then came the instrument, the saw. It was not sharpened like a sword, but rugged, made to tear wood and bone alike. Its teeth bit deep, tearing rather than slicing, ensuring that progress was slow. Executioners showed it to the crowd like a trophy. The condemned often cried, begged, or spat curses. None of it mattered. The first cut fell between the legs, splitting flesh where shame was greatest. This choice amplified humiliation and horror, ensuring that pain intertwined with degradation. With each downward stroke, the saw dug deeper. Blood pooled beneath the victim, staining the ground crimson. The audience gasped and winced, yet no one intervened. Cruelty was not just permitted. It was sanctioned by law, religion, and fear. At first, the victims screamed. Their cries echoed across the square, piercing ears and rattling hearts. But as the sawing reached muscle and bone, the voice weakened, fading into desperate gasps. The sound of metal grinding against ribs filled the silence. Executioners worked in pairs, each holding one end of the saw, pulling back and forth with mechanical rhythm. They did not rush. Their task was not to end life swiftly, but to stretch suffering as long as possible. Every motion was deliberate. The people shifted between horror and fascination. Some covered their mouths in disgust, while others leaned forward with hungry eyes. The punishment was both theater and warning, a stage where human agony became the ultimate performance. Religious leaders framed such torture as divine justice. They preached that suffering cleansed sin and that public executions purified society. The saw became not only an instrument of death, but a symbol of God's wrath upon the wicked. The victim, meanwhile, often clung to consciousness far longer than one might imagine. Suspended upside down, the heart continued to pump blood toward the brain, even as the torso split apart. Some lasted until the blade carved halfway through the body. Every stroke revealed more of the human anatomy, muscle, bone, and marrow displayed for all to see. Executioners were not surgeons, but in their hands the human body became a grotesque lesson in anatomy and endurance. The stench of blood filled the square. Dogs barked and strained at their leashes, drawn to the scent. Flies swarmed around the open wounds, a sickening reminder of how quickly life decays into something carrion and vile. The condemned's body twitched with every movement of the saw. Fingers curled and uncurled, eyes rolled back, and chest heaved in irregular rhythm. Life clung stubbornly, refusing to yield even when the body was torn nearly in half. The executioners sometimes paused, allowing the victim to groan and writhe before continuing. This prolongation deepened the torment and gave the crowd more time to savor the cruelty. The silence between saw strokes was almost worse than the sound itself. The punishment was not always reserved for major crimes. In times of unrest, rulers used the saw to make examples of common thieves, rebels, or dissenters. It was as much a tool of political control as it was a method of punishment. In some regions, the saw was used against accused heretics. Religious courts ordered the execution, declaring that those who defied doctrine deserved no ordinary death. To be split in half was to be divided like their alleged loyalty to faith. For the victim, death came slowly, almost mercifully, only after consciousness finally broke. Sometimes it took hours. The brain, flooded with blood, fought to remain awake, prolonging awareness far beyond the point of natural endurance. At last the body gave way. The saw carved deep into the chest, reaching the heart. Silence fell as the condemned slumped, split nearly in two. The executioners dropped the saw and stepped back, their work finished. But the performance did not end. Town officials paraded the remains as proof of justice delivered. The body was often left hanging, bisected, a grotesque display meant to rot in the open air, a reminder that law and power were absolute. For the living, the lesson was clear. To disobey rulers, to question faith, to betray trust, all carried a price worse than death itself. The saw was not merely a punishment. It was terror given form, a warning etched into flesh and memory. Yet behind the cruelty lay human faces, executioners paid to cut, spectators drawn by curiosity, priests who justified the horror, and a condemned soul who screamed until they could scream no more. In this cruel theatre, everyone played a part. And when the crowd dispersed, when silence returned to the square, the stain of blood remained. It seeped into the cobblestones, a permanent reminder that beneath civilization's surface lay a darkness sharpened into steel teeth. The reputation of the saw torture spread across kingdoms like wildfire. Tales of victims suspended and carved apart became whispered warnings in taverns and shouted lessons from pulpits. The method was feared not only for its brutality, but for its cold symbolism. Unlike the sword, which could be swift, or the gallows, which snapped the neck in seconds, the saw was slow by design. It was chosen when rulers wished to make examples, when pain itself was the sentence as much as death. In medieval cities, executions were not hidden behind prison walls. They were communal events, celebrated like festivals. Merchants sold bread and wine near the scaffold, while jugglers and musicians performed until the killing began. Horror lived side by side with entertainment. The saw was reserved for special occasions. To announce one was to guarantee a crowd. The thought of a body split in half drew both revulsion and fascination, the same mixture that made people stare at fires or accidents. In Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the saw was most often linked with accusations of heresy. The Church demanded not only death, but humiliation. To be cut from groin to skull was to strip the condemned of all dignity. Accused heretics were paraded through the streets before their execution. Shackled and jeered at, they were called traitors to God. The spectacle began long before the first teeth of the saw pierced flesh. The journey itself was a rehearsal for death. Once the condemned arrived, executioners took their time preparing the beam. Ropes were tied carefully around the ankles, tested for strength, and tightened until skin bulged. The victim dangled helplessly. Their world flipped upside down, fear magnified by blood rushing to the head. The saw itself varied from region to region. Some were large two-handled timber saws, others were smaller but equally jagged. None were made for mercy. The iron teeth tore at bone as easily as oak, turning a living body into kindling. Crowds gathered early to secure the best view. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, some crying, others curious. Old men leaned on canes, whispering about justice. Even nobles attended, eager to watch law written in red upon human flesh. The condemned often prayed or screamed, but their words drowned beneath the chants of priests. Clergymen stood nearby, reading scripture, declaring the punishment holy. The victims' cries became proof of divine wrath, their suffering framed as sacred cleansing. Then came the first cut. The blade pressed against soft flesh between the legs, dragging downward in a steady rhythm. The sound was hideous, tearing, crunching, splitting, like wood being ripped apart, except it was human sinew and bone. The crowd gasped, some turning away while others leaned closer. Faces twisted between horror and hunger. Some fainted, but many endured, fascinated by how long a body could resist being cut in half. Executioners did not hurry. They paused to wipe blood from the saw, to rest their arms, to let the victim groan and scream before resuming. Each pause stretched out the torment, reminding everyone present that death was not a mercy to be granted quickly. Witnesses often noted how long the condemned remained conscious. Upside down, the flow of blood to the brain sustained awareness even as the body was mutilated. Victims could watch their own flesh being shredded, could hear their bones crack like splintering wood. Some prayed until their voices broke. Others cursed, spitting venomous words until their mouths filled with blood. A few remained silent, their faces blank, as if retreating inward to escape what the body could not. The executioners pulled back and forth, their motions steady, mechanical. They were professionals, hardened by repetition. For them it was a job, and cruelty dulled with routine. The screams of one victim blended into those of another. Yet for the onlookers, the memory seared deeply. Children who watched grew up with nightmares of screaming figures cut in two. Merchants returned home to describe the gore over supper. The image of red-stained cobblestones clung to their thoughts for days. As the blade advanced, it reached the pelvis, cracking bone with a sickening pop. The victim writhed violently, blood spraying from torn vessels. The saw teeth grated against marrow, and the smell of iron and sweat filled the air. The body twitched uncontrollably, hands clenched and unclenched, eyes bulged with blood pressure, and veins pulsed against the skin. Every nerve screamed, every muscle strained, yet the brain refused to surrender. Consciousness lingered, stubborn and cruel. Executioners sometimes stopped midway, leaving the victim dangling half-sawn to extend the display for hours. In some cases, victims were left alive, suffering until shock finally silenced them. The cruelty lay not only in the sawing, but in the waiting. The people of the Middle Ages lived in constant awareness of death. Famine, plague, and war surrounded them, yet the saw torture stood apart. It was not natural death, but manufactured agony, a reminder that men could be more merciless than any disease. In Germany, records tell of thieves punished by the saw for stealing from churches. In France, it was used against traitors who plotted against the crown. In the Ottoman territories, similar punishments were recorded for spies and deserters. Everywhere it appeared, it carried the same message: to betray authority, whether sacred or royal, meant not just dying, but being erased with pain so vivid that people spoke of it for years after. The condemned body became a lesson carved into flesh. The sight of it, the sound of it, the memory of it, all served rulers who thrived on fear. Power was not just spoken, it was displayed in the screams of the dying, and when it was finally done, when the saw reached the chest and carved the heart in two, silence fell. The executioners stepped back, breathing heavily. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others crossing themselves, a few vomiting in the dirt. The bisected corpse was often left hanging for days, flies feasting, dogs circling. It decayed in public, the stench rising with the wind, a rotting sermon on the cost of disobedience. For the survivors who watched, the lesson was carved deeper than the saw's blade. They carried it home, into their families, into their prayers, into the way they bowed their heads before rulers and priests. Fear was the true executioner, and so the saw became more than a tool. It was a weapon of memory, a ritual of terror, and a performance in which pain itself was the message. No one could forget it, and no one dared to challenge those who wielded it. The saw torture did not vanish with the Middle Ages. Its shadow lingered for centuries, whispered about in chronicles, repeated in sermons, and feared in villages where rumor spread faster than fire. Even when it was rarely used, its memory alone controlled the masses. By the 17th century, new forms of punishment had begun to emerge. Gunpowder, gallows, and prisons replaced some of the old brutalities. Yet the saw never fully disappeared. In remote corners, it still resurfaced, called upon when rulers wanted spectacle above all else. Stories tell of rebels captured during uprisings, who were not simply executed, but displayed as warnings. Their bodies were suspended, and the saw sang through flesh, reminding onlookers that rebellion was not just dangerous, but unbearable to endure. Even in regions beyond Europe, similar practices existed. In parts of the Ottoman world and Asia, sawing was documented as punishment for spies or deserters. Though details differed, the essence remained the same: suffering prolonged, humanity stripped, and fear multiplied. Religious authorities often defended it with scripture. They claimed the wicked deserved to be divided, their bodies split, as their souls had been split from righteousness. The saw became a physical mirror of spiritual corruption. But not everyone accepted it quietly. Philosophers and early humanists began to question such cruelty. Writers whispered that justice was not the same as torment, and that rulers who thrived on blood would be remembered with shame. Still, the practice lingered because fear was useful. No sermon carried as much weight as the image of a man or woman writhing while a saw bit into bone. No law spoke louder than the sound of screams echoing through a city square. The psychological impact lasted longer than the blood on the stones. Children who watched grew into adults who never forgot. Entire towns could recall the details of a single execution decades later, as though it had happened yesterday. Executioners themselves became figures of both respect and dread. They were necessary, paid by the state, yet cursed in whispers. To them, the saw was only another tool, no different than rope or fire. But their eyes carried the weight of what they had done. The condemned, stripped of name and dignity, became stories told by survivors. Each victim lived on not as a person, but as a warning, a tale to frighten apprentices, children, and restless peasants. Their agony became the vocabulary of authority. By the 18th century, the saw torture was fading into history. Enlightenment thinkers argued for less brutal punishments, replacing spectacle with prisons, fines, and exile. The public thirst for gore dimmed, though never disappeared completely. Yet even as the saw grew rare, its legend endured. It appeared in writings about martyrs, in folktales whispered around fires, in grim illustrations that traveled across Europe. People no longer needed to see it with their eyes. The idea alone was enough to terrify. Modern readers may struggle to imagine such cruelty, but for those who lived under it, the saw was not imagination. It was the steel teeth glinting in the sun, the crowd pressing close, the helpless body dangling, and the shrieks that tore the air apart. In the end, the saw torture stands as a symbol of humanity's darkest instincts: the desire to control through fear, the hunger for spectacle, and the chilling fact that pain can be turned into performance. And though centuries have passed, the echoes remain. The saw may no longer cut flesh in public squares, but its memory cuts through time, reminding us how thin the line is between civilization and cruelty sharpened into steel.